Welcome to Ufahamu Africa, a podcast about life and politics on the continent. I'm Kimmy Dion, your host, and I'm joined by my co-host, Rachel Beatty Riedel. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Kim. Hello to our listeners. So, this week we have a very special episode by our non-resident fellow, Basil Ibrahim, who's interviewing Dr. Ted Moya Mose about the Africa Climate Summit and Africa COP28, generally about the energy transition and finance and climate change. Dr. Ted Moya Mose is a legal professional and Oxford Martin Fellow at Oxford University, whose interdisciplinary interests extend from international energy law and policy to the just transition to sustainable energy systems. Dr. Moya thinks about the dilemmas of developmental aspirations that remain tethered to carbon-intensive pathways and shares with us the ways in which the politics of these big summit meetings, talking about the Africa Climate Summit and COP28, shape the possibilities or limitations, the pathways for thinking about a just climate transition.
I'm really excited to listen to that interview. Rachel, you and I talk a lot about climate. I think some of this is just because, we have kids who are part of this generation that are really focused on climate. And like I'm starting to do a little bit of work on climate politics. And I know like you and I have been like trading films, like documentaries to watch about climate. And this is just a shout to our listeners that if there's something going on related to climate and environment in Africa, something other than these kind of like, these big, I'm sure necessary events that bring countries together, we'd love to hear about your recommendations. So always, feel free to send us an email or drop something in the comments on our website, ufahamuafrica.com, and let us know what you're watching or listening to that you encourage us to listen to. Kind of related to the topic of climate, this week I edited a piece that we published in Good Authority. It was commemorating today, the day that we're recording is World Refugee Day. It's a piece by Leonid Paysakin, Nick Stoop, and Peter van der Wint that draws on their forthcoming article in the American Political Science Review that studies what leads people to host other people who are seeking refuge. And the kind of the introduction to that piece is talking about, people seeking refuge from war and conflict, right? And also people seeking refuge following climate disasters, right? And the tragedies to the soils and the land because of the earth warming. And so they point out, various conflicts that are happening in Sudan and DRC, as well as climate disaster happening in Somalia that's leading people to seek refuge elsewhere. And so now their research draws on original data that they collected in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, where actually Nick and Peter have been conducting research for over a decade now, I'm sure. Now, as they write in their piece, violent conflict has been endemic to parts of the DRC for decades, and the country is home to the third largest population of internally displaced people, with 6.7 million, and that's 6% of the population in the DRC in need of refuge. As in other contexts around the world, the people providing that refuge are host families, right? That I know that a lot of us who live in the West, when we think about, when we hear politicians in our countries talk about refugees and migrants seeking refuge, we think about Western European countries hosting them, when in actuality, it's, a lot of these people are staying in the regions where they're from, or even in the countries where they're from, and they're being hosted by host families. Now, in their research, they find that empathy is the most important correlate of opening one's doors to forcibly displaced people. They find that the most empathetic person in their study, which was a study that happened in 15 different villages in DRC, the most empathetic person was 20 percentage points more likely to host than the least empathetic person. And most of the hosts said that they were motivated by compassion, noting that they themselves had experienced displacement or could easily imagine their households being displaced. And people should read the piece that Peter and Nick and Leonid wrote in Good Authority, because you can get some insights, not just from the researchers, but also from some of the 150 semi-structured interviews that they did with host families in Eastern DRC, and you can hear about, in their own words, why Congolese people are hosting other Congolese who are displaced.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And the lesson of like how do we think about where empathy comes from and how do we foster that in our society, I think is just so critical around the world. And really being able to put oneself in others' shoes. From a sense of familiarity or context or just understanding, it just takes me back to Rawls and like thinking about, we could each be born in any other circumstance. And so how would we want to create together a just society that helps one another? So I look forward to reading that piece. Now, for our listeners who have been listening to us talk about the South African elections, and have been wondering about the fate of the ANC since they lost their majority hold and have had to build a coalition government, we have some updates for you. So breaking news, the President Ramaphosa was sworn in this last week for his second term by making a coalition of what they're calling a government of national unity. Now, that's a contested term because it's not all of the parties, but South Africa's two largest parties, the African National Congress and the Democratic Alliance, the second placing party with 21.8% of the vote, have reached an agreement to form a unity government. Now, this includes, as well as those two parties, also includes the Inkatha Freedom Party, which is a more socially conservative party that draws its support mainly from Zulus in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, and the right-wing Patriotic Alliance. And a fifth party, a smaller party, the Good Party, GOOD, led by current South African Tourism Minister Patricia de Lille. So together, this coalition holds 273 out of the 400 seats in the National Assembly. And the two notably absent parties from this national unity government are the third and fourth placing parties, right? So Jacob Zuma's MK and Julius Malema's Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF, refused to join said government of national unity, and they've together forged a union of opposition parties called the Progressive Caucus, which holds about a third of
Hmm.
the seats. So really interesting dynamics. We have a clear coalition of the governing party and a clear opposition. And the opposition is really staking out its space by saying that, Zuma and this ANC, or Zuma has denounced this ANC Democratic Alliance coalition as a kind of white-led, unholy alliance that's there for big business and white control of land, the benefit of the markets, and not for the people. Um, Zuma boycotted the first sitting of, or his party boycotted the first sitting of Parliament, and it's alleging that the recent vote was rigged and calling for fresh elections. So, this kind of, again, anti-system, sowing distrust them, but also a very clear policy difference because the EFF and the MK together have put out a kind of election or drawing on their election manifestos. Both parties wanted to nationalize the mines, the lands, and the banks, and the EFF had, made suggestions that it would want to transfer land from white South Africans to Black South Africans. Now, white South Africans still hold 72% of the country's private farmland. And the EFF had also said that it was in favor of expanding social housing in white-owned areas to promote full integration and social cohesion. So, they are really, the EFF and MK, led by Zuma, are really saying that this is a marriage of convenience to consolidate the white monopoly of power over the economy and means of production. We're not selling out to that vision. So, Here we are, we have a very kind of fierce opposition. What will also be interesting is to think about how will this alliance between the ANC, with their strong proponent of affirmative action policy, work with the DA, which had long time, been in opposition to the ANC's affirmative action policy. The DA had been in opposition to the minimum wage, to government-funded National Health Service. So there are real policy differences within this new governing coalition. And so, analysts are seeing the union as fragile. It will be regularly tested from the outside by opposition, from the inside by members who do not agree on policy positions. And so we will, really see what the next months and years hold. But it's certainly the case, given, the very clear staking out of opposition territory that has been made, that a failure to make this unity government work could further fraction the ANC as a party and set up Zuma and his alliance of kind of ANC breakaways for further gains in the next election. So that's our update on South African government.
Yeah, it sounds like, we're probably going to have more in the months to come. I mean, I think, we probably haven't covered a lot of South African politics over the course of the podcast's, 200 episodes. And I think that's largely because it's been more of the same, right? Like there just hasn't been a lot of, it's always been the ANC. Um, but I think, this really is a new era. And a lot, right, the super majority, right? They didn't need 273 seats in order to have a majority coalition in parliament. But maybe they do because, right, as you point out, Rachel, their policy priorities, even their policy preferences are so different between the ANC and the DA that, time's going to tell whether they're actually going to agree on policies and whether this coalition may actually weaken the ANC in the future because they'll be unable to actually pass the kinds of policies that they'd want, or if the ANC is going to be able to get people from this progressive coalition to vote with them if they make progressive policy. Not that I envision the ANC is going to make a lot of progressive policy in this coalition, but if they were to attempt that, like, and to try to win favor with members from the MK or the EFF, if they'd even be open to that. I am really curious to know whether that's going to happen. But, something that stuck with me, Rachel, as you were talking about this was what sounded to me like really populist rhetoric coming from both the MK and the EFF. And I know, in your larger project with Ken Roberts and Jennifer McCoy at Georgia State, just thinking about, populism and democratic backsliding, right? So these things are kind of, I don't know if they are related or if they're just moving together, right? So the MK and the EFF kind of challenging election results while also making these populist appeals to the electorate. Like that to me, you know, it's a bit concerning. Not to say that the ANC doesn't deserve it. I mean, look at all the corruption, right? Like it's not like so saying the elites are corrupt is it's not just rhetoric, like it's also factual. So, but like using those appeals while also talking about election integrity, and then also making these policy proposals, it's really, like I said, it makes me think that we're going to talk a lot more about South Africa than we probably have in the past, just because there's a richness to the politics and policy making that I think we're going to witness that we might not have been seeing in the past few years of ANC governance.
Exactly right, Kim. And we had countries where you have a dominant ruling party, policy making is done within the party.
Yes.
So by the time you get to the legislature, everything's already decided, right? But now it's going to be all of these deals and the how we piece together who policy is for and how it's done, and how do we try to translate democratic will to governance is going to be there for us to see. And exactly right, the kind of the concern about mobilizing any kind of anti-system support versus really offering alternative ways of thinking about delivering democratic governance is definitely top of mind. So we will stay tuned to South Africa,
Yeah.
and so we hope.
And for our listeners who, are really into African politics, um, which are mostly presidential systems, right? And so are unfamiliar with the bargaining that Rachel's talking about in a parliamentary system where there's a coalition government. Um, I'm going to recommend, if you have access to it on Netflix, to watch the fictional show Borgen. So that if you've lived in a presidential system your whole life and you don't quite know how parliamentary politics works when there's a coalition of parties governing and that coalition can be fragile, Borgen, is set in Europe, not Africa, of course, but it does kind of give you a behind the scenes narrative of how parliamentary politics and negotiations work. And so that could, it's a light touch introduction to parliamentary governance and coalition making and understanding what that means for high level appointments, right, to cabinet, but also to policy making. And maybe that's why I think this is so exciting, is because, I've watched a lot of Borgen over the years. And so I'm wondering, like, what's going to happen in South Africa now? But we'll have to stay tuned.
Exactly. And stay tuned. We'll keep informed through all of our colleagues and our non-resident fellows. So for now, stay tuned to learn more about climate politics with our non-resident fellow, Basil Ibrahim.
I'll say right from the outset, Africa currently contributes the least to global carbon emissions, roughly 3%, yet bears the brunt of some of the highest impacts of climate change, because a lot of the people who are particularly vulnerable to climate impacts reside on the continent. This is not fair, because some of the poorest countries are in Africa, and Africa is, through history, least responsible for the climate crisis. We know 600 to 700 million people do not have access to electricity, and many of them reside on the continent. So what are we transitioning from, and what are we transitioning to? Well, you need justice, just transition from carbon-intensive economies. Our priority is access to energy and modern standards of life. I'll give you an example. I live in Oxford at the moment. The average home has 9 smart devices, and this is not the average wealthy home. I'm picking a neighborhood that I know is a low-income neighbor. An average American fridge uses 459 kilowatt hours of electricity a year. This is more than half the households in Africa use in a year. That's one appliance. So why should Africans accept one charging point and a solar panel that gives them one light bulb as energy access? We must talk about minimum standards of energy access. As much as we talk about energy efficiency, Africans will continue to ask for modern services, but also advanced nations must find ways of not consuming too much. And so we must begin to look at these disparities and find out, in what ways will the American public enjoy the things that they're enjoying without consuming that much and destroying the planet? At the same time, in what ways can Africans enjoy more energy services that are powered in sustainable ways?
That was Dr. Ted Moya Mose introducing this episode on the just transition and setting out a preliminary conversation on Africa and the global ecological crisis. Dr. Mose is presently an Oxford Martin Fellow at Oxford University in the UK. His interdisciplinary interests extend from international energy law and policy to the question of how to work out a just transition from carbon-intensive, sustainable energy systems. Dr. Mose's unique perspective draws from work experience in East and Southern Africa, India, the UK, and the US, and it has produced a sympathy with those most vulnerable to climate and ecological catastrophe. His work analyzes the dilemmas of developmental aspirations that remain tethered to carbon-intensive pathways. He joins us on Fahamu to give us a first-hand perspective of the Africa Climate Summit and the COP28 meetings he attended in 2023. We discuss the politics of the meetings and what these portend for a just climate transition. Ted, what do we mean when we say climate and when we say climate change?
The rise in global temperatures leads to various problems. There's weather changes. Weather is, the day-to-day, what you see in your forecast, and it'll more rain, it'll be a bit hotter. That's weather. The sum total of which, when taken for several years, becomes climate. And so if we look at patterns, if you zoom out from the day-to-day changes, we are seeing the highest recorded temperatures consecutively over the last decade that we've seen in recorded history.
Indeed. 2023 was the warmest year since records began. Why is climate change significant?
What this does, it changes how humans and the environment interact. For example, up to last year, the Horn of Africa had 4 years of failed rain season, and 70% of farmers in Africa were subsistence farmers. And most countries' economies are dependent on agriculture. It meant that for 4 years, people who were relying on agriculture for survival, not income, some of them did not make it. So we're talking about loss of human lives. But this also changes not just lives and livelihoods, it changes cultures. In the Horn of Africa, and I can speak about a cluster that I have been looking at recently, the Carib cluster, they are pastoral, their wealth lies in their livestock. Their livestock is not just money. When these animals died, it changed the societal fabric. In the Carib cluster, we saw people terminating their lives because they felt they had nothing to live for. And we are talking about impacts well beyond humans. We are talking about the global ecosystem. So we saw a lot of wildlife dying. And then, melting glaciers. We will see extreme weather on a year-by-year basis. How can we abate this? I'll speak for energy. Energy is responsible for between 78 to 83% of carbon emissions. So how we extract, develop, use, and dispose of energy is fundamental to halting the climate crisis. A study done about 5 years ago revealed that 90 companies were responsible for 63% of carbon emissions. So this is not just to point fingers at governments. We also need the private sector involved in creating a global solution to the problem.
With those elaborations of the concept of a just transition and of climate crisis, let's discuss global attempts to prevent or mitigate the worst of this present and intensifying danger. Please tell us about the Africa Climate Summit.
So the inaugural Africa Climate Summit was held in Nairobi, Kenya in September 2023. It was a moment for African leaders to collectively address the continent's pressing climate challenges. Global conferences do not have the nuances of the challenges developing on the continent. The central theme of the summit was decarbonization for prosperity. The emphasis was that decarbonizing the global economy is not merely an environmental duty, but also an opportunity for shared prosperity. And essential to mention at this stage is that when people look at sustainability or climate action, they may think that development is inimical to climate action, which is not true. And so the Africa Climate Summit was to bring these African voices and other entities to discuss how Africa can participate in climate action while still developing.
These dilemmas between social and ecological justice and the imperatives of capital and the state, what is often glossed as economic growth and sovereignty, are central to your work. We will share links to that in the show notes. Please tell us, Ted, what were the outcomes of this summit?
I'll start at the end and then fill in what happened in the beginning. One of the main outcomes of the Africa Climate Summit is that it should be institutionalized. It shouldn't be a one-off, but there should be an institution, a platform for discussion. There should be expected impact and success factor. How do we institutionalize all these recommendations so that we don't have forums that are merely talking shop?
Right. That is essential. These summits ought to do more than serve as way stations on the road to perdition.
So the summit's outcomes culminated in what is called the Nairobi Declaration on Climate Change and Call to Action. What it intended to do is to create a roadmap that advances Africa's climate agenda. It aimed to outline recommendations and calls for international commitment to supporting Africa's efforts to adapt, mitigate, and transition to a low-carbon future. What then happened, given quite a few diverse interests? So there were, I would say, roughly 6 main outcomes. There was a consensus that decarbonization was a good pathway to equality and prosperity. But it became obvious that the economic realities of different African countries are diverse, and some of them do not want to take the same pathway. It was now a question of how does that consensus become nuanced with the economic realities of different countries. For example, oil-rich countries like Nigeria will find the transition difficult because it's not just a question of supply of energy, but a loss of income. Other countries like Kenya have good wind, solar, and geothermal potential that has helped move very quickly down that sustainable development pathway.
Right, Ted. So against perceptions of a common African or global South position, you're painting an intensely variegated picture. To carry on, what else happened in Nairobi?
So one of the biggest transition issues is climate finance. Who will finance transition? This is particularly difficult because climate talks and forums tend to be quite combative, as there is a subsequent question of who is responsible. There's an old, globally accepted environmental law principle, the polluter pays.
Mm-hmm. This recalls what you said in your introduction of the concept of a just transition, that an historic analysis of carbon emissions, the link between pollution on the one hand and wealth under the globally hegemonic development model, shows that those who are most vulnerable are also the least likely to have the resources to build or participate in alternative, less destructive economies.
I attended quite a few sessions at the Africa Climate Summit, touching on trade, agroforestry, and carbon credits. And across all these sessions, the just transition boiled down to money. The summit attempted to address the need for a new financial architecture and systemic reforms, because we know a lot of African countries are riddled with debt, and the financing architecture does not allow development to happen at pace and climate action to happen at the speed with which to stop it becoming an even greater catastrophe.
Right. As we've seen with the recent Indian Ocean cyclones Hidayah and Liali and the subsequent floods across East Africa, but even more broadly in relatively wealthy societies across the planet, vulnerability to the climate catastrophe correlates very strongly with poverty. How did the money question play out at the Africa Climate Summit?
The question is, who is going to finance this transition? Why is this important? Because we know that we will need trillions of dollars in financing to transition from a fossil fuel world to a world in which we're relying on sustainable and clean energy, and where economies are responsible not only for wealth, but for human lives and the environment. The questions of the debt crisis in many developing countries was highlighted, which led to questions of how do we mobilize funds for climate-positive investment? It's imperative to mobilize not just African finance, but international finance and international development partnerships. The question is, how do we have sustainable international partnerships in a space where different countries are differently responsible for climate impact? So the nature of international partnerships for a low-carbon transition is going to be something that we will negotiate for some time.
That's crucial to think with. Recent headlines show that even now, wealthy countries continue to make money off the climate crisis, in particular by lending to poor countries at market interest rates.
The questions of reforming the financial system and establishing a new financial architecture seemed to have been agreed. There was the proposal for a new global climate finance charter by 2025, but when it was taken to the UN General Assembly shortly after, it was voted down. And so we have different initiatives that have tried to change unfair financial rules applying. We have the Bridgetown Initiative, we have the Accra Marrakesh Agenda, there was the Paris Summit for a new global financing pact, all of which were quite positive during the meeting. But when it comes to actually putting money to align with these goals and ambitions, we're quite a bit of a difficulty. We are seeing serious problems. There are currency fluctuations, rumors of an impending recession, and developing nations are facing a debt crisis. So the current funding requirements exceed the borrowing capacity of many national balance sheets, especially in times of crisis. And we saw this with COVID-19. It becomes very difficult to gain access to additional funds to help vulnerable people, and climate change is creating unprecedented problems.
Creating and exacerbating pre-existing problems, yes. Beyond the particular case of the just transition, we hope to have Sunan Ufahamu, a global development economist, to speak about ideas for a new just financial architecture, one that allows the closure of the productive capacity gap. This is a response to the fact that when an economy is treading water, barely able to survive in constant crisis mode, especially with regard to fundamentals like its currency, debt obligations, its capacity to grow and distribute food. Such an economy cannot grow itself into climate readiness. It cannot grow itself into the capacity to reduce poverty. It would need external support in terms that do not further weaken its economy, like is it the case at present with predatory economic regimes of unequal exchange or those exorbitant interest rates we were discussing earlier. Did the summit propose climate financing that was different from what's prevalent today?
Yes, I think I'll sum up what happened at the Africa Climate Summit with one of the most controversial proposals made there. It was the creation of a global carbon tax or financial transaction tax. So at the beginning, I mentioned that the polluter pays. It is an agreed principle. How is this principle applied? In national contexts, we may have constitutional provisions that cover that. We may have climate laws that cover this, so someone can be sued. And if they're found to have been the polluter, they pay. But when we look across the international divide, carbon taxes are usually a very good measure. So we have regulated markets where governments step in and say, if you exceed a certain amount of CO2 emissions, you pay a tax on it. This is called a compliance market. Then is the private market, which looks at carbon credits and carbon trading, which is what we call the voluntary market. The private sector, once they emit to a certain stage, decide we need to buy credits or to ensure that we are removing as much as we're putting in the air. The goal is net zero. Net zero is about not emitting more carbon than you're taking out. And how do companies do this? Because they're hard to abate sectors, cement, mining, steel, construction, tech. What they do is go out and find places where there are nature-based carbon sinks. There's a forest, there's a conservation area, there's biochar that takes out carbon, and then they pay for it. But the trouble with this market, especially for Africa, is that without any regulatory mechanism in existence, it's been the buyer's market. Many countries in Africa do not have any carbon taxation or regulatory measures. So private sector has been continuing to emit and pay very little to those who are responsible for carbon sinks.
Yeah, this is essential to think about. Given the lack of support for solidarity transfers or even for reparatory payments from wealthy countries, not even among Western liberals who admit the crisis and claim to be concerned about it, like the US's lead climate negotiator, John Kerry. The focus has then shifted to how to extract payments for the transition from the circuitry of capitalism and to then disperse these finances where climate vulnerability demands it. Therefore, not a shift from the harmful system that produces the ecological crisis in the first place, that produces vulnerability, but rather a very conservative conjuring of these streams that propose to mitigate harm, just redistributing a sliver of profits, all the while allowing the machinery to continue uninterrupted.
So what was suggested was that we need a global carbon tax and we need a financial transaction tax, which is designed to generate revenue for climate-related investments, to remunerate those who are responsible for preserving the environment, and to sort of stop or penalize those who are polluting with abandon. The proposal was opposed by some of Africa's largest economies, like South Africa and Nigeria, who have very high emissions, and it was still under debate. But there were other criticisms. Quite a few African ministers had serious concerns about the conclusion of the summit. The Comoros, for example, an island nation, which holds the rotating presidency of the African Union, was highly dissatisfied with the exclusion of the oceans and blue economy questions in the text. Botswana, that there was no clarity on the critical issue of climate change adaptation. Egypt called for explicit doubling of international funding for climate change adaptation. The Republic of Congo's Minister for Environment disapproved vaguely worded text on carbon sinks because the Congo Basin forests are one of the largest carbon sinks, and there was no reference to that. So the trouble with the Africa Climate Summit is that you cannot have the most ambitious outcomes where you have very large consensus-built forums because you take the path of least resistance.
That sounds like many unsatisfied state representatives.
Yes. I think many countries were unhappy with the final outcome, which is fair. Normally, when everyone is displeased, it's a sense that some compromise was reached. But I'd say that developed countries left happier than developing ones because the global north countries made even more pledges at the Africa Climate Summit. But there was no binding follow-through mechanism on those pledges and commitments. So I'd say the high polluting entities kicked the can further down the road and were probably the net beneficiaries because the Africa Climate Summit was threatening to create an alternate sense of climate and financial power in multilateralism. And I think things were not pushed as far as they should have. Yes.
I get that countries like South Africa and Nigeria are at present high net emitters. Aren't their internal dynamics such that they would be net beneficiaries of a shift from the global status quo?
One would assume that, but they oppose them for a variety of reasons. One, they are heavily reliant on hydrocarbons or fossil fuel, which are most responsible for climate change.
Does this elaborate the difference between incomes from fossil fuels at the fiscal level, at the level of the national treasury, and the lived reality of the extreme vulnerability for the everyday resident of territories under these states? So paying attention to the news and activists, one assumes that pastoralists, farmers, people suffering extreme weather events like flooding and drought in, say, Cape Town, the Adamawa, the Benue or Limpopo basins, would have an interest in an accelerated transition. Why would Abuja or Pretoria be opposed to this?
Well, if you dig slightly deeper, you understand why they would be opposed to it. Because as the highest national emitters in Africa, they would then be on the sharp end of the global carbon tax. And do not forget that these countries don't just rely on fossil fuels for their internal development. They rely on them for their global revenue. So if there is a tax imposed, it means that the price of the oil would either be uncompetitive or that a lot of those revenues would be taken up by some form of tax. Secondly, there are peculiar circumstances. For example, South Africa is part of what is called the Just Energy Transition Platform, announced in Glasgow during COP26, which means that they have already secured transition funding. It hasn't been paid out yet, but pledges of more than $8 billion were pledged to South Africa to help them transition from reliance on coal to renewable energy. So South Africa will not be happy with anything that will make it difficult for those funds to be directed to their country. And there are already existing carbon taxes that many exporters from Africa are opposed to. They see that the carbon border adjustment mechanism imposed by Europe. So if your goods are produced in carbon intensive ways, there is a tax imposed on them, making them more expensive and therefore non-competitive. And so these are some of the fears that quite a few African countries that are exporting do not want with a carbon market. So the highest polluters understandably objected to it unless there are certain provisos that then allow them to transition. And this is what the transition negotiation is about. How best do we move without leaving anyone behind or having transition become so impractical that it will not work?
This makes it sound like those who wield fiscal power have to work out their priorities. Are they loyal to the present carbon-intensive, eco-destructive system of economic interests, or to the urgent needs of their people? Which of these two consistencies will they prioritize at Climate Finance Forum? Ted, what then happens at the COP in Dubai?
Yes. So to start into COP28, COP28 was the first committee of the parties which expressly agreed that fossil fuels are the main culprit behind climate. In previous COPs, this has not been the case. And this was especially remarkable because it was held in the United Arab Emirates, an economy largely dependent on fossil fuels and that has developed rapidly because of the petrodollar. So what happened is that over 100 countries committed to significantly ramping up renewable energy and improve energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is the other fundamental being entrenched at these COPs.
Just to say here that I regret I did not draw Dr. Mose on this question of energy inefficiencies, but it is worth thinking about. We know activist groups like Insulate Britain in the UK or movements against fast fashion across the planet are pointing out that cutting down energy waste would by itself yield great emissions reductions
this consensus about fossil fuels has some thinking that this is the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era. But I was there over the last couple of days and stayed a day or two extra. And the final texts were so badly watered down because although there was an acknowledgement, there wasn't a real desire to have a binding commitment that would then stop the production of fossil fuel.
Right. Underlining once more that this extends beyond the question of knowledge. It isn't just the denialists, those who reject connection between human action and the climate crisis. Even among those who concede this link, there is a radical gap between understanding on the one hand and action.
So some argue that COP28 was a success, some that it was a failure. The venue of COP was deeply criticized. Some said, how can you have a climate champion who is responsible for climate and biodiversity crisis? But I was in Glasgow, and Scotland is an oil and gas producer. It was one of the most ambitious COP. Katowice, deeply reliant on coal, and where some of the best texts on this came out. The next one will be held in Baku,
in Azerbaijan.
Yes, which is also an oil producer. The success was that there was a strengthened call for climate action, and the COP28 was the beginning of what's called the global stocktake, under which mechanism states make what are called nationally determined contributions, which are upper emissions limits, what they are going to emit or allow to be emitted as carbon emissions in their country. And then every subsequent year up to 2030, each COP will be doing an accounting and asking, are you meeting your goals or not? What is self-evident from the Declaration of Nationally Determined Contributions is that the pledges that countries made in Paris in 2015 are very far from the reality of their existing emission. And so it was recognized that we need far more radical emission cuts, more than 40% by 2030. And countries were asked to submit more ambitious national climate plans by 2025. So whatever they've been pledging has not only not been ambitious enough, but it's not been met enough, which therefore calls for even more ambitious pledges and even more ambitious and determined action. So it's not just about emission reduction anymore. We need adaptation strategies. Adaptation means finding ways in which, looking at the current situation, what are the best ways of ensuring that with the current circumstances, lives and livelihoods are not lost and the environment is not further damaged. Finally, it was clear that the interconnectedness between climate and biodiversity crisis, whether it's species disappearing, extreme weather conditions leading to changes in ecosystems, this was recognized. And so there was an increased momentum in addressing biodiversity loss as well as climate change, which was quite new.
Yes. That connection between various ecological crises seems essential going forward. The new literature on maladaptation in the IPCC reports laments this capacity in climate action, a capacity to create harm when potential remedies for the climate crisis are implemented in isolation from this broader ecological crisis. So you may have a supposed solution that can do more harm than good by diverting land away from food production, for example, destroying forests, worsening water scarcity, and unleashing significant amounts of emissions across supply chains, even when the final product seems green. A carry-on thread.
I must say something that stood out for me, and there is a lot of climate hypocrisy from the US and the European Union. They talk a good game, but when you walk into negotiation rooms, they take some of the hardest line positions, not wanting their funds to be committed to other countries. And that is one thing that I found extraordinary in COP28, that the public statements do not match the intricacies of negotiations. The EU is known for leading a lot of work on the climate and biodiversity crisis and for some of the highest uptake of renewable energy. But when it comes to meeting climate finance commitment, the EU and the US were not keen on having any binding commitments. I have mentioned increased climate finance pledges, but it's not been enough. Developed countries have pledged about 100 billion per year, and they pledged this in Paris in 2015. A lot of that has not been implemented, so additional funding is crucial for developing countries to meet their climate goals and their climate plans.
Right. We're all learning that wrestling with hypocrisy and blind spots of ostensibly progressive leadership is a central dilemma of struggles for justice. On the one hand, it is fundamental to Western liberal political identity, to its imagination of itself as a progressive governance framework. It performs the language and theater of fairness, equality, and justice. On the other hand, there's a clear reluctance to break with the political economy that produces global injustice, intense expropriation, accumulation by dispossession, disposability, and desperate violence. But on that note, Ted, how did COP28 compare with the previous COPs?
I've been involved in maybe 4 now. This COP was different in a variety of ways. The highest form of representation, at least that I have witnessed in the COPs I've been to, there was a lot of private sector work. But I think the most exciting thing about COP28 was not the public sector, big headline, state-centered work, but the discussions that were had between activists, community members that were there. I think, to me, outside of the public and private sector, the community third sector conversations were far more enriching, and they were broader this time.
Chiming with this, we hope to bring on the show community activists from South Africa who are speaking from the front lines of the ecological crisis. But most surprising, we also saw at the COP a few strident voices among ardent capitalists taking on an activist role for green technology. The interventions and investments reveal that a shift away from fossil fuels is currently underway. For example, the Total CEO, Patrick Pouyanné, publicly rejected the obfuscating carbon capture and abatement technologies in favor of using renewables to completely phase out fossil fuels. Similarly, the Australian mining magnate Henry Forrest made an impatient call, proposing a complete phase out of fossil fuels in his mining firms by 2030. He proclaimed the readiness of the science and promoted the economics of technological fixes for transition. Is this change, even from emissions-intensive industries like oil and mining, is that encouraging?
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of technology and innovation in terms of working for climate, for the just transition. However, technological innovation can create as many problems as it solves. For example, you talk about mobile phones, and we know critical minerals, or what are called transitional minerals, rare earths needed for processing, come from very specific regions, Latin America and DRC. So we also have to look at the mining value chain. How fair is this transition to the people who live near the mines? What benefits are going to them? But at the same time, if you look at the involvement of China, for example, in the solar market, solar prices have plummeted several 100% because of manufacturing capacity and the improvement of technology.
Right.
And I've seen places like Scotland, where the sun doesn't shine as much as other places, have an extremely high uptake of solar power. So technology can solve problems, but it's not the panacea. We need not just technology, we need a good regulatory environment, we need money taken to the right place, we need transitional justice. So if how these essential technologies are structured and manufactured and distributed and priced is not as fair, we will have a highly technical, in terms of just capitalistic view of benefits, yet losses in terms of biodiversity, loss in terms of people's culture, disproportionate expense on and exploitation of particularly vulnerable people, which is not right.
Exactly. For example, there's an ongoing campaign from the DRC to hold Apple to account for its profiting from supply chains that have such a devastating and destabilizing effect on life in the Congo. So many ostensibly clean technologies of the future have these dire emissions and non-carbon related externalities that are obscured in their supply chains.
And that's why, for me, the just transition, you cannot avoid questions of justice. You cannot take a market-centered, state-centered, legalistic view of it. The law must also evolve to meet these social ambitions and goals. But yes, technology has been a key factor and can transform energy access as much as energy efficiency. If we have, say, nuclear fusion that is not dependent on radioactive materials, it would be wonderful. If the efficiencies and the cost continue plummeting, the transition will be much quicker. So yes, I am pro-technology, but it has to be one of the suite of tools that are used to address this problem.
Right. So attending to the global political ecology of the crisis, you mean, to who is dispossessed, where pain and loss accumulate so that others may accumulate profits elsewhere. This, what the scholarship calls the free things of capitalism, these unaccounted externalities, the off-ledger costs that societies must bear. So we need a shift away from the focus on what's beneficial for the national treasury and royalties, taxes, GDP numbers, what produces the profits of global capital and attracts external FDI flows, Even in these firms like, say, Tesla or Goldman Sachs, that present themselves as green with this new focus on ESG, for example.
Yes.
Ted, on this note about the intuitive sympathies of decision makers, let's speak about the tension between decarbonization and development. I remember here Ecuador's path-breaking foray with the Yasuni oil field, its attempt to draw compensatory global payments for stranding or keeping the oil and its subsequent emissions in the ground in return for these payments from across the world. Do growth and development necessarily mean high emissions? Can we achieve welfare advancement in, say, Cabo Delgado or the Limpopo while avoiding high carbon economies from exploiting these fossil fuel reserves?
That is possibly one of the most difficult to answer because development is an imperative. And a lot of Africa's problems boil down to poverty or to how to harness the wealth and resources the continent bears. Development is unstoppable. It's a question of how to make that development sustainable. And one of the things about transitional justice is looking at the global disparity in consumption. I'm sure some have heard about degrowth. This is difficult to speak about in Africa, where, as I've mentioned, you have more than 500 million people having no access to electricity. You cannot tell those people to degrow. The desire to enjoy the essential services that other people do is a fair ask. So climate action and sustainability are not opposed to development. In fact, the rise in solar is as a direct result of industrialization and technological development in China. So it is a very difficult question. It requires a closer look at who doesn't have access and who is over consuming. And then we try and correct that. But the reality is Africa needs to be at the core of this.
Right. But thinking about aspirations and, say, from the perspective of a traffic jam in carbon-intensive Cairo or from the din of air conditioner in Lagos, how many such high-carbon cities can you afford anywhere, given the global carbon budget? What is the model pathway that avoids these carbon-intensive economies, and what would it be to pursue particular welfare outcomes, say, guaranteeing effective, safe transport as a service rather than as a business, producing economic growth?
That's a very good way of putting it.
So perhaps the scale question is crucial. Rather than a framing of Africa, South Africa, or Nigeria, one wants to isolate those 500 million who do not have electricity, transport, water, or housing and serve those particular people. So we would then have innovations that aspire to create material outcomes that make for a decent life, rather than imagining justice as an expansion of the way of life and carbon cost consequent from, say, the right to a personal car to cheap parking and ever more elaborate superhighways. So contrast perhaps between the car's new bus and bike system and Nairobi's elevated expressway. So every investment choice has an opportunity cost, so that even inside of Africa, a model of justice, this transitional justice, will demand shifts in aspirations, in prioritization, and the allocation of scarce public funds so that the vulnerable can progressively have more security, more energy available to them. Is that right?
Let's look at it as a systemic question. In what ways would we produce transitional energy? You've mentioned a scalar problem, but even when we look beyond Africa as a continent and we start looking at these small pockets, how energy has been produced in the past is outmoded now. Normally it was extraction, production, transmission to populations that were far from where the energy was being produced, and then distribution and supply. Now, one of the ways of resolving this, instead of having centralized energy, is to decentralize it. And decentralized does not mean rooftop solar. It means seeing where are these pockets of population and producing enough to suit them. So you avoid transmission losses, you avoid very high investment costs. And this is just one technical solution that I'm talking about. So smarter, more localized energy systems where energy is produced closer to where it's consumed will not just make economic but ecological sense. That's one. Two, we have legal solutions that can come in where we need enabling legal policy and regulatory frameworks to make these innovations possible. We need financial and economic solutions built into social frameworks. The people who are highly impacted need to be involved in all of these decisions. And so, because it's a systemic problem, one of the things is not to use solutions of the past to try and solve future problems.
Did you see any of these innovative systemic solutions, breaks with past models that are appropriate to the design of an alternative world? Would you say the loss and damage fund is such an innovation, a source of hope for the most vulnerable?
I suppose that's the saddest question, because although there was glimmers of hope, when the rubber met the road, the loss and damage fund was deeply and highly contested, and the money is not forthcoming. So the loss and damage fund is a transitional mechanism. Essentially, the countries that have polluted the most, that have the history of the highest emissions, and therefore have the most money, should fund the transition, should create a fund that helps developing countries to sustainably do what is called leapfrogging, which means not go through the same development path of reliance on coal, oil and gas for industrialization, damage the environment, and only later try to decarbonize. So the trouble with that is that the more advanced countries, the ones who would be responsible for funding it, we don't have a standard or a measure or law or a resolution that would compel them to do so within a certain frame. Instead, we have the existing paradigm of making pledges and then following up in a subsequent COP to see how those pledges are going. That does not move the dial. So other innovative mechanisms are needed. For example, I think development of carbon markets is an inevitability and possibly one of the best chances to harness global finance. One of the best ways of making the private sector pollute pay. It's now a question of how do we do that? Distributed ledger technology can create platforms through which funds with different aims can come together. When we talk about carbon finance, there are different finance mechanisms. There is grant, which is basically not a loan. You're given money to do these things. Then there is debt, which is a loan. Then in the private sector, we have equity, which is where people give you money and take a share of your business. And then, we have philanthropy, where people have set up funds to help. All of these have different outcomes, but they have the same goal. So how do you use the same vehicle, the loss and damage fund, to make this possible? And I think something like distributed ledger technology can create the transparency, the immutability to mix all these funds so that if a philanthropist wants impact, they can see on the system whether there's impact. If it's a loan, someone can see how well their loan book is doing. If it's a grant, they can see who has received their grant. So I think we need to start thinking differently, to develop new financial mechanisms. Also, to change the reliance on one currency, because currently there's a skewed focus on the dollar in the world, and on the receiving end of that imbalance, a developing country. And this is because they have very weak currencies compared to the dollar, which makes their goods cheaper when they are exporting and makes essential transitional imports extremely expensive.
Right. And these transitional technologies you were discussing earlier would be reliant on a just economic and financial regime, the transfer of raw materials or the transfer of the innovative technologies themselves. Dr. Mose, thinking about everyday culture, our sense of who we are, who we owe, we're responsible for, one imagines the necessity of a different form of social and political attachment, of organizing resource distribution and framing questions of fairness. So with a global surge in nationalist sentiment across the planet and the tearing up of even the hypocrisies that held together the global political order and agreements such as the COP, what cultural and political changes would be necessary for a just transition? And what glimpses of the future have you seen in the collectives at the COPs?
I've seen glimpses, and I think one of the things that must change is the global economic and political culture. We must move toward accepting that we share the same fate, because how international relations have been, it's always been inward-looking and insular, and countries serving their self-interest. A delegate from Uganda said we're all under the same sun, and the planet is constantly reminding us that we must begin to see this shared fate. COVID-19 also revealed that whether you're in the global north, in the global south, whether you're wealthy or not, catastrophes can put us in the same box. So back to your question, what glimpses are there of change in the culture? The first is multilateralism needs to change its focus from a state focus. This is not a government or a national problem. This is a global problem. And so we must have instruments or principles and aims that cut across. If we say climate action is essential, is the village elder in, say, Benin or the DRC as involved as the ambassador at the UN conference in movement for energy justice and environmental justice, in negotiation for the just transition? We have what we call cosmopolitan justice, that regardless of where you are, we have an interconnectedness by nature. And so we need to establish these common threads, whether they're commercial, social, economic, or political. And I think if we begin to have that cultural change, having a recognition of the importance of cosmopolitan justice in addressing these questions, then whatever the subject, whether it's creating access to transitional funds or how money is deployed or how to negotiate for your state, some of these would be fundamental principles or binding commitments from which we will not waver.
Well, cosmopolitan justice is a powerful summation of the changes necessary for a just transition. As a lawyer, what is your sense of attempts to motivate political institutions toward the just transition through the force of law, or even through authoritative legal advisories? I'm thinking here of the Vanuatu case at the ICJ, a tiny island in the Pacific, asking that the highest court in the world issue an advisory opinion that pushes the largest, most powerful states to act not in a narrow national interest, but in concerted defense of those most vulnerable to global temperature and sea level rises, no matter where they are. I'm thinking also about a case brought to the European Court of Human Rights by youths from Portugal who were affected by horrific wildfires there, and then a similar case by the Verein Klimasenioren, Schweiz. This was Climate Association for Elderly Ladies, before the same court, the European Court of Human Rights. Both of these charged that European states were failing to protect the respondents from the claimants from the climate catastrophe. What do you make of these efforts?
The Vanuatu case is a prime example of rising climate litigation. Judiciaries are now part of the solution architecture, especially where states, either because of how their political economies or how politics is worked out, will go to international settings like the Africa Climate Summit or COP28 and make promises, but not actually take any action at the national level. We are beginning to see that judiciaries at every level, whether it's international, in this case the ICJ, or at the national court, judiciaries are called upon to address, to interpret these principles and to compel states to take action. And so the Vanuatu case is one of many. There are others, in what ways can judicial decisions compel either legislatures or executives? How can you move them to action? Well, there are several changes that are needed here. Number one, judiciaries need to be equipped and alternate, because you see, judiciaries make decisions based on their essentially national judicial philosophy. They need access to climate vulnerable voices to become sensitive to global realities and developments. And that's why I end on this note saying that platforms for discussion such as this are so important, because they disseminate information, hopefully make clear our interconnectedness, our shared fate, help us develop pathways that is accessible to less technical people and find ways to move us on to action. So thank you very much indeed for having me on.
Right. We have planned interviews with South African climate and social rights activists to explore the question of whether judiciaries, even under the most progressive constitutions, can actually compel states or compel capital to act preemptively to defend the most vulnerable from ecological disaster, even after a court ruling. Where ultimately do the state's fundamental sympathies lie? Relatedly, and although we didn't have time to discuss it further, it may be useful to think about education and activism that transform and even overhaul social culture. Could these produce new customs of practice, new social attitudes that are ethical and just, so that broad social shifts carry society toward a just transition and shape global political life, guide decision-making spaces, including the COPs, the Climate Summit, and not just at elections, away from these instincts to side with power and the accumulation of wealth, and instead shift toward a more just resource distribution. Yeah, it seems to me that this focus on cultural transformation may help achieve a resolution of the dilemmas of Dr. Mose's work. Supplying the vision, the imagination that tilts decision-making processes so that the hypocrisy Dr. Mose laments, conflict between stated political commitments on the one hand, these concealed prejudices and interests on the other, that may be worked out in favor of the voiceless and the powerless. Thank you, Dr. Mose, for the gift of your time and knowledge.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Ufahamu Africa. You can find more episodes, show notes, and transcripts on our website, ufahamuafrica.com.
This podcast is produced and managed by Megan DeMint, with help from production assistants Chukwufunanya Ikechukwu, Alex Kozak, Harry Stoltz, and Michere Muguero. Our non-resident podcast fellows are Ami Tamaklo, Fu Asedu, Expedi Olagu, Basil Ibrahim, and Hopalong Botulkane. We are generously supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and receive research assistance from Cornell University and the University of California, Riverside. Our music is courtesy of Kevin McLeod. Until next week, Safiri Salama.